Okay, all right, so let's go ahead and get started here. We're going to finish off with the last half of chapter 2 here. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, all right. So you all should be able to see you all should be able to see my screen here, right? So we're going to go ahead and finish up here with the Constitution here. I think this is where we left off, right? So I just wanted for us to just kind of touch on the Texas constitutional development as well here. Um, so the first couple of constitutions, especially this first one, the Coahuila y Texas Constitution. This, of course, was going on, when Mexico had just gained their independence, from Spain. Of course, we just had, Mexican Independence Day this past weekend. Um, the idea was to have the state, to have Coahuila y Texas, to be conjoined because of the fact that Texas was just very sparsely populated, right? We talked about this in chapter 1, right? That you only had those small outposts, right? In Nacogdoches, San Antonio de Bejar, and then eventually San Felipe de Austin with Stephen F. Austin and the original 300 families coming over to Texas, right? So the population still was very, very small in Texas. It ended up growing as a result of the former Americans' immigration to Texas. But because Texas was still very sparsely populated, they decided to have these two states conjoined. And so there's a few aspects of the Coahuila Texas Constitution. Um, one of the aspects was the idea of unicameral legislative bodies rather than bicameral. But again, don't really worry too much about these earlier ones, especially when we get with the Republic of Texas. Um, Obviously, of course, we have the setup to where we start having these different levels of government here. So we start to see that a little bit more pronounced due to the influence from the U.S. Constitution and the Americans, being used to that system of government. So the Mexicanos, of course, they were experimenting with that because if you recall from history, that Mexico started off as like an empire, right? They started off with an emperor, for the first couple of years, and then they moved on to a republic with the 1824 Constitution. And of course, they borrowed heavily from the American Constitution. Like, keep that in mind that during this, the independent war, the wars for independence that were going on in Mexico, not just in Mexico but also in South America. You're probably familiar with a gentleman by the name of Simon Bolivar. With Bolivia, the country Bolivia is named after. So there were these revolutions going on in Central and South America. Uh, you know, Definitely inspired by what took place within the American Revolution, right? And of course, there was also the Monroe Doctrine that foreign policy decision by the United States to try to limit expansion by Europeans into the Western Hemisphere, right? So that also played a role in furthering the independence of these nations. So I wanted to mention that this is where this idea of democracy started to be implemented, not in Mexico, but then once Texas became its own independent republic, they started to it started to mirror more of the American style constitution. Then statehood as well. So of course we have major changes within the state now. Of course, with Texas being part of the United States now, of course they were eligible to send representatives to Washington. So you had the two senators going over to Washington, which Sam Houston was one of those two senators for many, many years. But then and of course eventually he became governor, like we talked about in chapter 1. The Civil War Constitution mirrored what was going on at the state level, but the only major difference, of course, was the rhetoric that really encouraged and how do I say it, that really strengthened the role of slavery, right? Because of course, keep in mind that was the reason why Texas decided to secede from the Union and join up with the Confederacy. What's the slavery issue? Then, of course, we had the Reconstruction Constitution briefly, but then the Radical Reconstruction. So when you're going through this chapter, these are the two that I want you all to focus on, because the Radical Reconstruction Constitution, of course, this one was led by Governor E.J. Davis, one of the most infamous governors in Texas. And he was infamous because what he was trying to do was he was trying to replicate what the national government was doing, the federal government was doing in terms of and if I've already talked about this, I do apologize, because I know I also teach other Texas government classes, so sometimes it's hard for me to keep track of where I've been here. But the point is that with the radical reconstruction, basically how we can sum it up is that Governor E.J. Davis, being a unionist, wanted to replicate the union style of government that we saw in Washington, right? So he wanted to have a executive branch that mirrored the executive branch of the federal government. So what I mean by that is that he wanted for the governor to appoint all of the state executive offices, right? Just like, the president does, right? The president appoints, the cabinet members, the heads of the departments and the agencies at the federal level. So E.J. Davis wanted to replicate that in Texas, where the governor would make those same appointments. He would appoint the lieutenant governor and comptroller and all, and the attorney general and all of them. That was the goal of Governor E.J. Davis, right? So he wanted to replicate that, the same separation of powers and checks and balances that we saw at the federal level, but also keep in mind that the Texans were not very happy with this, right? Most Texans did not want for the state to basically look like the federal government. Remember, Texas, of course, was a former Confederate state, and a lot of these, former Confederate supporters, still had a lot of animosity towards the Union, which is, totally understandable in terms of, where they were coming from, right? Having lost the war, I'm sure, there was a lot of bitterness, resentment, anger, with this idea of the Union Army coming over and, in their eyes, occupying the state of Texas, right? So they looked at the Union Army as kind of, adding insult to injury, so to speak, right? So during this time, you have, and that's of course why it's called the radical reconstruction, radical against, the overwhelming political ideas and culture of Texas. But then once Reconstruction ended, then we had the current state of Texas Constitution, which was a direct result of what the radical Republicans have tried to do, and so they basically undid all that stuff. They made the executive deliberately weak to where the governor was not going to appoint these other executive offices. These offices would be independently elected. We'll talk about the plural executive right now. And so they just made all these changes to ensure that, the governor would not have as much power as they had before during radical reconstruction, because that's not how the conservative nature of Texans wanted for their government to be run. It doesn't matter if it's something that makes, in some eyes makes more logical sense or things like that. Not to say that there's a right or wrong way to do these things, but Governor E.J. Davis was making a logical argument as to why he wanted for Texas for the governorship to look more like the presidency, because he felt that would be more efficient. So he had his logical reasons, but at the same time, the Texans also had their own logical reasons for why they did not want to have it that way, right? They felt that a less centralized government is better for the people, because they agree more with the Jacksonian style of democracy. Because you have to keep in mind that a lot of these people, like we talked about in the last chapter, right? A lot of these people that were coming over to Texas were from the American South, so they were bringing that conservative political ideology with them. So they didn't want for there to be a strong centralized state government. They wanted to have the government, for the governor had decentralized power. They didn't want for the governor to appoint judges. They wanted for those judges to be elected. So I wanted to explain that historical aspect here so that you can see why the Texas Constitution is set up the way it is. Okay, so now let's talk about the present Texas Constitution. So the constitutional revision, right? So like I was saying, after the radical reconstruction period ended, Texas reformed its constitution and was sure to reincorporate several of the following principles. The idea of limited government, going back to the Andrew Jackson style of government that was very popular with conservatives in the 1830s. This idea of, like I said, not having a strong central government, but diffusing that power amongst, local governments, and, having local control, basically making those major decisions. Because like we talked about in chapter 1, this was one of the major reasons as to why the Texas Revolution happened in the first place, a pushback against a strong centralized government that was trying to limit, local decisions and local control, right? So anyway, so with the examples of limited government, term limit on governor was for 2 years. Of course, this has changed to where now governors have 4-year terms, but originally the governorship was limited to 2-year terms. And also keep in mind that throughout much of Texas's history, that there hasn't really been too many governors that have been reelected, right? If you look at the list of governors from the 1870s all the way up until, like the 1990s, when George W. Bush kind of started this trend of governors getting reelected, to where now we've only had 3 governors in the since the 90s, right? So um, so we've seen that trend has kind of bucked here, where instead of having a lot of turnover in the governor's mansion, now we're having uh, more of these governors getting reelected, right? We've had George W. Bush, who was reelected and would have continued serving, but then of course he ran for president and won, so he took that promotion. Rick Perry served for several terms until he decided not to seek, the governorship further. And then, of course, we had Greg Abbott, who has been governor since then, right? So we've seen how that these governors have now served for longer terms than before. So just wanted to throw that in there. State debt ceiling of 200,000. The biennial legislative sessions. This is something that's also very interesting. So again, what I want you all to see through this is that as we get closer to the end of the chapter, we're going to see that there are some, there are some people who feel that we might need to kind of update things, but I want for you all to see that some of these provisions that we that were instituted through the 1876 Constitution are still around even to this day. We still have the biennial legislative session. So what that means is that this is a departure from what we have in Congress. So if you look at Congress, Congress is always constantly meeting, right? Yes, they go on recess, they go on breaks every now and then, like on, they have for the holidays and vacations and things like that. But they're always usually working, right? They don't take like a year off or something like that. Whereas in Texas, they have the biennial legislative sessions where the legislature only meets once every 2 years. So what happens, and this always happens in the spring of it always happens in the spring of the odd number years, right? So we're in an odd number year, 2023. So we're not going to have the legislature is not going to meet together as a session until January of 2025. So that's interesting, right? That's interesting and we'll talk about what that means in terms of how the legislature has to get so much done in such a short amount of time, because then they're not going to be able to meet as a session. I mean, they still have meetings, like they'll have like hearings and things like that. So they'll still do kind of like other things, like behind the scenes or things like that. Some administrative work, and sometimes they have these public hearings, but they can't actually propose legislation and vote on legislation until the next biennial session. So we just had the session that just wrapped up. There was a couple of special sessions that Governor Abbott called forth, and of course we also had the Ken Paxton situation. So they were very busy during this session. But with that being said, just keep that in mind that this is different from what we see in Congress, right? Where the legislature meets once every 2 years. They usually meet for about a spring semester, as I like to call it. So they'll start in January and then they run all the way until May. So kind of like a spring semester here. So just kind of think and think about what are some of the ramifications of that, especially in today's day and age, as Texas has gotten so much larger, both population wise, and with that also comes an increase in government responsibility, because there's more people, so more government is needed to manage those people. And then very few appointments by the governor. So this is true very much so when it comes to the state executive offices, right? And we'll talk about those state executive offices later on in the class, right? But the point here is that, like I was mentioning earlier, that the governor does not make the appointments of the state, the high level state executive officers. Like I said, like the lieutenant governor, attorney general, comptroller, commissioner general land office. These are people that are independently elected from the governor. So what this does is this actually creates an interesting situation where you could potentially have members of opposing parties actually be serving in the state executive offices. It hasn't happened because Republicans are still winning the elections. They still have the majority within Texas politics. But theoretically, you could have a situation where, let's say, you've got a Republican governor and then you have a Democrat lieutenant governor. So that'll be interesting to see how they'll be able to if they'll be able to work together, especially with the way politics is so polarized nowadays. We'll talk about how even amongst the Republicans with this Ken Paxton situation, that there's even disagreements, like between like Dade Phelan, the Speaker of the House, and Dan Patrick, the Lieutenant Governor, who's basically in charge of the Senate. But we'll talk about that later on here. But anyway, so the point is that there's very few appointments. The Texas Secretary of State, who is the top elections official in Texas, that position is appointed by the governor, as well as the governor appoints a lot of boards, such as like the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board and some of these other, uh, you know, regional boards and things like that. You know, there are a few boards that are elected, such as the State Board of Education and the Texas Railroad Commission. But for the most part, a lot of these boards and commissions are appointed by the governor. So the governor does have more numerous appointment powers within those boards, but in terms of like the high-ranking officials, that's not really done by the governorship. And then, of course, the tolerance of racial segregation. Also, keep in mind this is during the, you know, during the beginnings of the Jim Crow era, you know, and the racial discrimination that was going on in Texas. Of course, we'll talk a little bit about that in the next chapter. But yeah, so obviously, of course, you know, keep in mind, you know, the time in terms of when this Constitution was written, and you know what was going on in the country at the time. Of course, you know, the separate but equal doctrine put forth in the Plessy versus Ferguson case, and ultimately, pretty much cementing this idea of separate but equal and the rise of, you know, discrimination and segregation, not just in Texas, but throughout the American South as well here. So, but again, we'll talk more about that. That's more so for federal government. We'll talk about that a little bit in chapter 10 in Texas coming here. Okay, so let's take a look at the general features here of the present Constitution. Okay, so I mentioned before how that with our U.S. Constitution, it's a very short document. There's only 10 articles within the U.S. Constitution, and some of those articles are really short. The longest one is Article 1, which has 10 sections, which discusses Congress's job description, and then Article 2 is the presidency, and then of course we move on to the federal courts, and those don't have the president. The Article 2 only has 5 sections. So, and of course, as I've also mentioned, the U.S. Constitution has only had 27 amendments in its 250 years, and as I've said before, if you don't even count the Bill of Rights that were tacked on during the ratification process, you can make the logical argument that the U.S. Constitution has only been amended 17 times in 250 years. So it's very short, broad, open to interpretation. A lot of constitutional historians and scholars say that it's very flexible, that it allows for, because there's not so much in there, there's not so many details, that you can make a lot of inferences, you can make a lot of different interpretations to the Constitution, even things that are, have strong wording, like let's say the Second Amendment, where they talk about, the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, but then of course there's the well-regulated militia part. So even there's some differences of opinion, right? So because it's not entirely spelled out, people have different opinions and different viewpoints on what the Second Amendment means to them, and in all of these cases, these people make very strong logical arguments, right? It's just people have different opinions about how they want to view those arguments, right? So again, even within things that are more directly said, you can still have some different debates and different discussions, right? And of course, we talked about the necessary and proper clause before. This is what gives Congress the ability to pass legislation based on the Constitution. So because the Constitution is not so wordy, it empowers Congress to kind of fill in the gaps, because there are a lot of gaps in there, because there's a lot that's open for interpretation. It allows for Congress to kind of fill in the gaps and pass laws. The Texas Constitution is like the polar opposite of that. When we talk about highly restrictive document, this is what we're mentioning, right? So the Texas Constitution, and also difficult to interpret even by the courts, along with many amendments. All of this goes into, as well as very long and poorly organized. So all of these general features are pretty much, excuse me, give me just one, hold on. All of these features, like I mentioned in the Texas Constitution, are pretty much the polar opposite of what we see within the U.S. Constitution. So unlike the U.S. Constitution that's short, broad, open to interpretation, the Texas Constitution is very lengthy, lots of detail, no room for interpretation, or hardly anything, any room for that, because there is so much wording in there that it's meant to try to cover every circumstance, every scenario, right? It's kind of like if you read one of these, like these employee handbooks and these policy manuals, right? They have policy for everything. Think about that. We've got modern day policy manuals that are longer than our own U.S. Constitution, and those policy manuals do have to be constitutional, right? If you are like a school district or a public entity, you can't put policy that violates the U.S. Constitution, right? So they can they can add things in there as long as it's constitutional, then they're fine. But the point I'm trying to make is that a lot of these policy manuals do tend to be very lengthy. And so the Texas Constitution is not any different, right? It's got a lot of different scenarios, right? I mean, we've got over 500 amendments and counting. What I mean by counting is that this November we're going to have another state constitutional election where we can vote on whether to amend the Constitution again. I mean, this pretty much happens every legislative session. There's always like a couple of amendments. I know, what is it, 2 years ago, they had 10 amendments, 10 proposed amendments, and most of them passed here. Or I believe all of them passed. I'll have to take a look, but for sure, almost all of them passed. And they usually all do. But yeah, so we've got a few more amendments that are going to be coming up in November. So yeah, so that's what I mean by counting, right? We're going to have even more of these amendments. But again, yeah, it's highly restrictive because, like I said, there's policy for everything. There's even that video that I mentioned before for you all to take a look at it. The one from the League of Women Voters talks about how there's very specific amendments to the Constitution that deal with very specialized and specific things. Like another book talks about how there's an amendment that deals with something in Chambers County. Like, what does that have to do with any of us throughout the state as a whole, right? Couldn't this be something that could have been put forth in legislation, right? But again, and the reason why it's done this way, everyone, like I said, is that it goes back to this idea of decentralization, this idea that the people want to get involved in making those decisions, right? Allowing for more local control. So to not have the state government have all this authority to engage in a sort of top-down governmental approach. Instead, we do allow for citizens to get involved in the political process by the electing of these state and local officials, as well as getting involved in these constitutional amendment elections. So I wanted to explain the rationale for this in terms of why the state constitution allows for it to be done this way, right? So I want for y'all to kind of get a sense for, and again, if I'm not explaining this as well as I would like, again, please bear with me. Like I said, I'm not 100% there today, but I hope you all understand the idea that, think of it as, like I said, as a direct the direct opposite of the U.S. Constitution. Instead of being short and broad, it's very lengthy and specific. So many details of policy, right? Like I said, and very specific details of policy. Details that, like I said, don't even really involve the state as a whole, right? I've got the Texas Constitution uploaded here in the resources, and there's no way that we could go over it. It would probably take like several weeks to go over everything in there because of how lengthy it is, right? With the U.S. Constitution, I can cover that in the class, but not the Texas Constitution. It is way too lengthy, and it's like I said, it's very confusing, even by the courts, and their role, the state courts, their role is to interpret the Texas Constitution, but even they have problems with it because there's also what's called they call it there's also a lot of dead weight within the Constitution, where what that is that they've got provisions in there that are no longer constitutional because we've had the U.S. Constitution be amended to strike down some of these provisions, right? So like if there was any slavery, things in there, that of course obviously would no longer be valid. Of course, we had the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery, right? So again, there, things like that, there's a lot of that dead weight in there, which there have been movements to try to clean up all that stuff. But it's just something that, the state just not has really prioritized too much. But again, checks on government authority, like I was talking about, right? This idea that instead of the executive branch basically making all these appointments and making all these decisions, as well as the legislature, making all those decisions, sometimes, like I said, they pass it off to the voters to amend the Constitution, which we'll talk about that in terms of the process right here in a bit. But yeah, no clear lines of responsibility for governmental authorities. There's also overlapping jurisdiction, which we'll talk about here, especially in the judicial branch. We'll talk about that here as well. But with the specific features, okay, so we do have, at the beginning of the Texas Constitution, we do have the State Bill of Rights incorporated from the U.S. Constitution. And if you look through the State Bill of Rights, you'll see that there is a lot of overlap with the U.S. Constitution, that there is going to be the same type of wordage. There's going to be provisions against unreasonable searches and seizures. There's going to be, there's going to be provisions discussing, freedom of speech and things like that, freedom of religion. There's, all that stuff that we see within the Bill of Rights. It has been replicated in our state constitution as well. And that's the first thing that you'll see within the Texas Constitution is the Texas Bill of Rights here. So if there's one thing I definitely want y'all to look at within the text constitution, definitely do look at that here a bit. But the rest of this we can kind of discuss here. So of course there's still checks and balances. These are pretty much similar to what we see at the national level in that we have a very similar, if not almost identical, process when it comes to checks and balances. Where of course, an example, of course, is like we talked about with the recent Ken Paxton impeachment. This is an example of a check that the legislature has on the executive, right? The threat of impeachment, right, and removal of office, right? And one thing that is a little bit different that I've noticed that Texas does with their impeachment process is that unlike the federal government, where an official can still serve, while they're being impeached, like we saw this with Trump a couple of years ago, right? He was still president. He didn't have to vacate the presidency while he was under the impeachment, but Ken Paxton did have to vacate. He was basically on suspension. And just like with any job, right? If you get suspended from work, you can't be at work and things like that, until there's a resolution. So in Texas, they do that a little bit more, like I guess kind of like the way you see like with workplaces and things like that. But so that's an example, right? So a lot of these checks and balances are very similar. The veto power the governor has, right? That's also something that we see at the state level, and we'll talk about the how the veto is even stronger with the governorship because of this idea that the legislature doesn't stay. They're not constantly in session like we see with the federal government. So again, so these are some examples. Legislative branch lists restrictions rather than powers. This is talking about, it's kind of like operating on a glass half empty approach, where it doesn't necessarily say what their responsibilities are, like we see at the U.S. Constitution. It's more so what they can't do. Like the legislative branch can't do this, legislative branch can't do that. So it's looking at it as a glass half empty approach, because again, this idea of limiting government power as much as possible through this idea of conservative limited government, the orientation and the way that government operates with the wording also is very reflective of that conservative ideology. Executive branch, we'll talk about the plural executive, as we've already mentioned before, this idea that the governor does not appoint most, if not all, of the of the major executive offices. Those are independently elected. Judicial branch also is different from the federal government. So the plural executive is a major difference from the federal government. So of the three branches, the legislative branch tends to look the closest to its federal counterpart, in that the state legislature is almost identical to Congress, but again, there's a few differences, especially with the biennial sessions. But the executive branch and the judicial branch do have some major differences. Like I said, the executive branch more so in terms of how those officials, and same thing with the judicial branch, that both of these branches, the top, the top level officials are elected, so just like with the executive branch, judges are also elected in Texas, which is different from the federal. But there's also a confusing list of 6 types of courts. We're going to talk about this later on in the judicial chapter. We're going to talk about how there's all these different levels of courts. You've probably heard of these, like the municipal judges, justice of the peace, and even at your county judges, like your county court at law, and then moving on to your district judges. I mean, there's so many different courts, unlike the federal government, which just has 3 levels. The district court, which is your entry level federal criminal cases, the circuit court, which is your appeal court, and then the Supreme Court. That's it for the federal government. But in the Texas system, there's a lot more of these levels, and Texas is even more confusing than some of these other states, because at the top level courts, you have 2 of them. You got the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals that handles criminal cases, and you've got the Texas Supreme Court that handles civil cases. And the Texas Supreme Court also it gets involved in in some administrative matters when it comes to like supervising the law schools and so they've also got licensing responsibilities. But we'll talk about it later on in the judicial chapter. And then of course we also got local government. We'll talk about home rule with cities, and then the suffragette amendments here. We'll talk about it here. Okay, let's go and move on really quickly here. Okay, so the present constitution. Let's see if we can try to get this done here by today. So again, so the idea is major difference that we see from the federal legislative branch is that the legislature meets every 2 years, right? So again, they do not meet continuously. They meet every 2 years for about 180 days. And so what they have to do is, this becomes a very, I mean, you can imagine the stress that the members of the Texas legislature have to go through, because they got to get a lot of work done in a short amount of time. They're basically having to cram everything, I don't know if you've all seen that meme where like, there's this meme where like, math teachers on the first day of school, and then the math teachers, saying like we're already behind schedule. Like it's pretty funny because it's kind of like that, right? It's like we don't, we or like Willy Wonka, where he said, we've got so much to do in so little time, right? So that's kind of like how I think of the Texas legislature, right? They got to get the ball rolling already. This is why um, I'm because I've got some friends who are members in the state legislature, and basically what they have to do is they've got to they got to have the bills ready to go like on the first day. So it's kind of like with me, like setting up my class for the first day of school so that everything is set up and ready to go. It's kind of like with them. They have to be like, so during the Christmas break leading up to the start of the legislative session, they've got all their bills, that they're working on them, getting them ready to go and things like that, and they can introduce them on the first day because there's just not enough time to really work on that once you're in sessions. They got to do a lot of work, even before it starts to get them ready, right? So the number of days for introduction of bills, committee work, and floor action is specified. I also know this because I've spoken to one of the chief of staff of one of the House members here, and he talked about how that they only have until the middle of the legislative session to introduce bills because you can't be introducing bills right before the session is about to end because they got to wrap everything up, right? They have to already work on what they already have there because they're just not going to have enough time to be able to get to anything else after the midpoint of the legislative session. So they do have a midpoint deadline to introduce bills, right? So, and then of course, we'll talk more about the lawmaking process in Texas, which again is almost identical to what we see in Congress. Once a bill gets introduced, it has to go to its appropriate committee and things like that. And of course, it has to get out of committee, and then it goes down to the floor. And then of course, it's open to amendments from everyone on the floor and things like that. So, so that's what goes on. So it's a very rapid pace though, because they've got so much to do in so little time. Like I said, also keep in mind that because Texas is so large in terms of its population and its resources, that there is a lot that needs to be overseen in such a short amount of time. And that's why some people have said that, hey, maybe we should expand it to maybe, if you want to have a compromise, maybe not have the legislature meet continuously like Congress does, but at least have instead of a biennial, have an annual session, right, where they meet every spring. So that could be something that some people have looked at as kind of like a compromise, but it hasn't gotten the political support and things like that, which we'll talk about right now in a bit. So again, to permit early floor action, the governor can declare a state of emergency, where the governor can call a special session, which lasts 30 days, and then the governor, of course, sets the agenda, right? You can't introduce bills. It's basically what the governor decides that you all are going to work on here. Salary and per diem rates are specified. So the salary of these legislators is actually pretty paltry. We'll talk about that in the legislative chapter, how legislators get $7,200 per year. Just to kind of, and again, not to toot my own horn, but just to kind of give a comparison, I make more than that in a month. Like it's insane, like how little these legislators get paid. Now they do get per diem. If any of you all have worked in organizations, you're probably familiar with per diem. It's it's French for per day. So you get like an allowance, like per day, right? To use on food, lodging, which good luck with the per diem that they give to stay in Austin, because with how expensive Austin is. Just to give like kind of like a quick observation, like because I've been interested in maybe going for a state rep position. It's something I've thought of before, just because it would be interesting, to go and serve in the legislature. I've already thought that what I would do is I'd probably just get a trailer and just stay like at a trailer park there in Austin, because good luck trying to be able to buy a house there. It's just way too expensive. So that would be the way I would do that if I was there, But with that being said, yeah, they do get their per diem rates, but again, it's not very much at all. It's about $140 a day. So, and the book also talks about that if you could maximize your earnings with the salary and the per diem, you could make about 35,000 in a year that the legislature is meeting, but that's still very, very low for the job that they're doing. That's usually about the average that an entry-level state official makes. If you work for the state, I used to work for the Secretary of Juvenile Justice Department. Yeah, that's about how much I made, starting off. Was in the lower 30,000s, So I've been as a former state employee before. So it's just interesting, the pay inequity. And of course, this goes back to it's because this is the way the Constitution was written back then. These pay rates would be appropriate for the 1870s, but not necessarily today here, right? In terms of the way inflation has happened, right? And we'll talk about how that creates a situation where this pretty much eliminates, the average person to be able to serve in the legislature, which we'll talk about that later on in the legislature chapter. Legislature cannot authorize the state to borrow money. So the state has to operate on a balanced budget. It's not like the federal government where they can operate on a deficit. The state cannot have debt. Every dollar has to be accounted for, because the state cannot print their own money like the federal government can. Legislature establishes provisions for municipal employees to participate in Social Security programs. So yeah, do keep that in mind that the state does get involved in local government. Like again with the the municipal employees, this would be like your city employees, but they also provide compensation for like school teachers, right? Technically, they're employees of school districts, but they do get state retirement. So it's the same thing with me at STC. So as a professor, I contribute to TRS, the state retirement system, even though I'm part of like the South Texas College District. I don't know if y'all knew that there's also college district. There's school districts, for the K through 12, but there's also college districts in which the state is, divided up amongst the different college districts. And I've got to learn about this, for working for different colleges, that they are within these different districts. So for STC, our district is Hidalgo County and Starr County. Over in Cameron and Willacy, that's Texas Southwest, which I also teach for them as well. They handle, Cameron County and Willacy County. So, but with that being said, and then of course the exceptions made for Confederate soldiers, sailors, and widows for state to grant individual money. So again, this was a way for the state to provide some compensation, for service for people that served for the state, within, especially during the Civil War and all that. So again, and there's all this that's still in our Texas Constitution here. Okay. So let's get to the plural executive really quickly. So the executive branch. Okay. So again, the plural executive is one of the most important concepts that we should remember in Texas government. And it's a major departure when we compare and contrast the executive branch of Texas with the federal executive branch. So again, remember that at the federal level, the president makes these appointments to the cabinet. So think of this as kind of like Texas version of the cabinet, but the difference in Texas is that the governor does not appoint these, right? These are independently elected. So that's why it's called a plural executive. So the lieutenant governor, the comptroller, commissioner of general land office, the attorney general, members of the Texas Railroad Commission, the commissioners of agriculture, and the State Board of Education. All of these positions are elected independently in statewide elections. Now, the State Board of Education is a little bit different because they do have regional elections where the State Board of Education is comprised of regions. This is another position I was actually kind of thinking about going for as well. I had one of my friends who ran for it a couple of years ago. He's more qualified than me, so I would definitely, would support him to go for it. He didn't make it out of the primary though. Because he's done more in K through 12 than I have. So I kind of felt, good for him to run for that. But the point is that he was able to run locally because the region that we're at stretches from here all the way to Brazoria County. And the reason why, and that's another reason why I was considering doing it, because I have contacts in Brazoria County because my ex-girlfriend used to live in Lake Jackson, which is over there in Brazoria County. So I'm familiar with those areas like Lake Jackson, Bay City, Port Lavaca, Victoria. I've got, I'm familiar with those areas, the areas going towards Houston. So that's why I was considering doing it. But then, I thought, that's too busy. It would be hard for me to do that and do this job. It'd be virtually impossible. But with that being said, so pretty much all of these are independently elected from the governor here. And most of them are through statewide elections. What we mean by this is that everybody who lives in Texas that is registered to vote in Texas can vote for these statewide races, right? So for the governorship, right? It doesn't matter whether you live here in the Valley or in Dallas, Houston, El Paso, Texas Panhandle, San Antonio, Austin. Everyone that lives in Texas and is registered to vote in Texas can vote for these statewide elections, and things like that. So the governor power has been strengthened a bit here. So the 2-year term extended to 4-year terms. Also keep in mind, here's another big difference between the governor and the president, is that while the president is limited to 2-year terms, the governor's not. There is no term limits for governors. This is why Rick Perry kept getting reelected, and he could have kept getting reelected if he wanted to keep running. Greg Abbott right now, he can keep running for reelection as long as he wants to. There is no term limits, unlike, and do keep in mind that originally the president didn't have term limits either. This wasn't instituted until after FDR in the 1930s and 40s, right? So, so it's not really all that an uncommon idea to have unlimited to have unlimited terms for these executive officers. I mean, in Congress, we still have unlimited terms. There's no term limits in Congress, so we see that with the governorship as well here, right? The ability to remove individuals they have appointed. Now, this is something that where that the governor now has the authority to remove appointees. However, they do have to go through that approval process, in terms of getting this approval, from the legislature and things like that. It's not like what we see like at the federal level. Remember, like a couple years ago, how Trump was like firing everyone, like he was dismissing everyone. So he didn't have to go through it. So he has to go through an approval process to get them appointed, but there is no approval process at the federal level to remove someone. Whereas in Texas, there is. You do have to go through that process. You have to go through the same process of removing someone, and that's only if you appointed them. If you did not appoint them, then you cannot remove them. So this isn't really a problem for Governor Abbott now because he's been there for so long that pretty much everyone that serves, and what we mean by appointees, we mean not just these other boards, like I talked about the Higher Education Coordinating Board, but also like the DPS director and the major directors of the different state agencies and departments. Those decisions are made by the governor. So because the Governor Abbott has been there for so long, he pretty much could get to try to remove these people because he appointed them. Increased control over major policy boards such as insurance regulation and public education, like I mentioned. The Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board is a great example of this, right, where Governor Abbott makes those appointees, and the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board, as I mentioned before, this is the major board that oversees colleges, universities in Texas. And then control of Texas Office of Homeland Security, right? So the governor, of course, and the governor has used these police powers and these security powers a lot, especially when it comes to the border security issue, which Governor Abbott has been very vocal on this and has been very involved in this. Basically is in charge of DPS and can authorize for DPS to go and assist with border security, which, as we talked about before, we'll talk about more throughout this class, is a controversial move that's being made by the governor, but the governor definitely has a lot of logical reasons for why he feels empowered to do this, as we talked about before, right? He's got a stake in this, and so it just depends on how you see the issue, right? Do you feel that the federal government should be the only ones to be dealing with border security, or can state and local governments also get involved? It's just, that's the big question and the big debate right now. And because the Constitution is not as strict about that, it talks about rule of naturalization, but it doesn't say like that states cannot get involved. Because it's not that specific. That's why states can make some of these logical arguments, right? Now, of course, it's up for the courts to decide that, and of course, that's why we have. And going back to that idea of our U.S. Constitution being broad and open to interpretation, that's what allows for our federal court system to make all these Supreme Court decisions, right? Because it's not so clear cut. So we have an active judiciary that can weigh on these issues and interpret the Constitution, because the Constitution does need interpreting because it's very broad and open to interpretation. So that's why we have a lot of these Supreme Court decisions that have also created this case law, right? Like if you see, like with the overturning of Roe versus Wade in the Hobbs case, abortion is not mentioned in the Constitution, but because the Supreme Court has, as well as the other federal courts, they have the authority to interpret the Constitution through these very specific issues. They can make those judicial decisions, and then that becomes the law of the land. That becomes case law. Okay, perfect segue to the Texas judiciary now. So the organization, so in the judicial branch, confusing pattern of 6 types of courts, like I mentioned, all these different levels of courts. Because you've got and the way these courts are organized is that it's organized it's organized either by the level of offense, if it's a criminal case, or the amount of money that is involved, if it's a civil case, right? So an example would be like, if let's say, and unfortunately this actually happened to me, let's say you default on a credit card because you're looking for work and you have to make a choice between eating or paying your credit card. I mean, I think we know what decision anyone would make. So if it's not that high of an amount and the credit card company sue you because you're violating the terms and conditions of the contract that you signed when you got that credit card, which is totally in their right to do so, because if you default on a credit card, you are violating the terms and conditions of the agreement. So they have every right in the world to go and sue you. If they do, then depending on the amount, it will go to a certain court. So this happened in my situation. So I went to one of these justices of the peace because, again, it was only like about $1,000, so it wasn't that much. If it had been a lot more, if I was being sued for a lot more money, it would have gone up to the district court because they deal with, you know, larger amounts. The district courts are the ones who handle like lawsuits between companies where millions of dollars is at stake and things like that, you know. So that's going to be handled by a higher level court because there's more money involved and it involves more expertise. But yeah, so that's basically what it comes down to, that it depends on. So if we're going to criminal cases, then your misdemeanors are going to be handled by like your justice of the peace, right? Or if, let's say, it's a city ordinance violation, like if you get cited for too much loud noise, then you'll go before a municipal judge and have to pay a fine or things like that, because it's not that major. It's just a, you know, a minor violation. So that's how the judicial branch operates. But it's also confusing when it comes to the jurisdiction, right? Because each level of trial courts has concurrent overlapping jurisdiction with other courts. What I mean by this is that, so in my case, with that credit card that I defaulted on, it could have gone to either a justice of the peace, or it could have gone, you know, to one of these other county courts, you know. So you don't know which one you're going to get, especially when it comes to these really lower level cases, right? So that's why it's considered overlapping jurisdiction, because it's not okay, this amount is this court and then the next amount is the other court. No, it's kind of like in the middle, right? You know, so this amount could be it could go to either of these two courts. And I do understand the logic behind this, because they're trying to create a situation where they want to allow for there to be more versatility, to where different courts can kind of take different cases, so that you don't have one court being overwhelmed with all these cases and this other court doesn't have anything to do. But it does become confusing, you know, if you've got a case, because then you're not sure which court it's going to go to. Qualifications or lack thereof. No requirements for legal training for these lower courts. We're into, you know, I don't know if y'all knew this, but, you know, for these municipal and justice of the peace courts, you know, they call them justice courts now, but everyone knows them as justice of the peace. You do not have to have a law degree. You do not have to have gone to law school to be a judge at that level. Like, I could be a judge if I wanted to. I would just have to run for it. But then from the district courts on, you do need to have legal training and experience, because again, they handle more of these more stringent and more you know, more money and more you know, and stronger criminal penalty cases, right? And then judges are elected, right? So again, this is another major difference between the federal government and the states, right? And you probably have seen some of these signs already, right? Because I know we're coming up on some elections coming up, so I know I've already seen some signs for judges already. So next time you're driving around and you see some of these signs, look to see that, hey, a lot of these positions are for judges, you know. So in Texas, we do have, you know, judges that are elected. So if you never thought of that before, pay attention to some of the signs that you're seeing all across, you know, the towns, and you'll see that you know, if you ever read them, you'll see that, you know, a lot of them are judges running for these positions. Okay, local government. So we're almost done here, but then we'll finish. Okay, so local government. So again, local government is consisted of counties, cities or municipalities, and special districts. So I'm sure you're all familiar with, you know, counties. Obviously, we're in Hidalgo County, and of course the different cities here within Hidalgo County, and then obviously, of course, the special districts, which school districts usually tend to be the most commonly thought of special districts. But we also have other special districts like irrigation districts, which some of y'all might not have heard of them. We'll talk about this more in local government chapter. Counties are the most restricted. What we mean by this, and like I said, we'll expand on this in the local government chapter, because again, there's chapters for all of these different the different branches and different levels of government. Is that every county in Texas? So let me explain why the example of how it's most restricted. Every county in Texas has to have the exact same setup for county government. That you have to have one county judge that oversees the entire county, and then you have 4 county commissioners that oversee all the counties are divided up into 4 precincts, and so you have 4 commissioners, and this is the same regardless of population. So in the most populated county is Harris County, where Houston's at. That's several million people. So you've got, you know, commissioners. You've got some of these commissioners that are each county commissioner is responsible for like over 500,000 people. But then in Loving County, which I think it has more cows than people, you've got like one county commissioner that oversees maybe like 25 people. So just think about that, right? You know, that the system of government for the county level has to be the same regardless of population. And then cities have more they have more flexibility. They have a workable home rule provision. We'll talk about how home rule is basically where the cities can craft their own city charter, and they can set up their city government you know, how they want to. We'll talk about how some cities have, and the way this works is that some cities will have differences in terms of how they set up their city council. Like an example would be like Some cities have at-large elections where all the citizens of the city vote for, like, let's say there's 10 people running on the ballot and the top 4 end up becoming the city council members. But then you also have district votes where only people within a certain district within the city are eligible to vote for that election. So then you have 4 county commissioners, but from the 4 different precincts throughout the entire city. So those are differences that a city charter can have in terms of how they set up their government, whereas the counties do not have that flexibility at all. It has to be the same setup here, right? So if a city wanted to replicate what the counties do, they can, but they don't have to. Special districts are limited purpose on local governments with taxing authority. So like I said, school districts are a great example because they're limited in terms of what they can do, right? School districts are responsible for education, right? And education alone, right? They have a couple of things, like they've got like their own police force and all that, but their main goal is to deal with education, right? They're not going to be getting into banking or anything like that because that's not their role. Suffrage temporary transition provisions due to conflict with federal law here. So again, this kind of goes back to what I was saying here, that you can't have those conflicts, like the city charter cannot violate the Constitution, so to speak. Okay, so let's go ahead and finish up here really quickly because I know it's already going to be time to go here. So let's take a look at the amendment process within the Texas Constitution here, because the last thing also talks about the need for reform. So the book talks about some of these examples, like we talked about, maybe the compromise with the biennial legislative session, maybe trying to make it a yearly one, eliminating that overlapping jurisdiction with the judicial branch to where you have that clear, those clear levels of jurisdiction. The idea of the plural executive, maybe, maybe having a few more appointments, but again, this isn't going to go, too well. The county government having the ability to maybe operate more like a city is also something that's been discussed, and also detailed provisions within the Constitution, But anyway, let's go to the amendment process here really quick because I know it's already going to be time to go. So let me go ahead and finish up here. So, okay, so the way amendments are proposed in Texas, this is the way amendments get on the ballot to us, like we're going to see in November. We cannot propose amendments ourselves. It has to start from the legislature. So this can happen either during a regular or a special session. It requires a 2/3 majority approval from both the House and the Senate to approve, this proposal to amend the Constitution. So you need 2/3 votes from both chambers. The governor does not get involved in this, right? It does not go to the governor's desk to get approved. It then goes straight to the voters, right? The legislature chooses the date of the election, and again, these usually happen in November to coincide with like the national voting day, which is in early November. So that's why they do it, to try to, so that it's not as confusing for people. The proposed amendments must be published once a week for 4 weeks in every county. So in a few weeks, we're already going to start seeing this. Once we get into October, leading up until early November, we will start to see the amendments being published here. And then the simple majority passes the amendment. So you need 2/3 to get it onto the ballot, but then you just need a simple majority. And because it's a simple majority, this is why, as you can see, the majority of amendments have been passed. We're up to 507 at the production of this edition of the book, and we'll probably, and like I said, we're probably counting, because I'm sure we'll get some of these amendments that are going to be passed from this legislative session. I'm sure some of them will pass as well here. So do keep in mind that's the way the amendment process is. So I definitely encourage you all to vote in that upcoming state constitutional election here. Okay, so let me stop the share here really quickly, and let me stop the recording.